So it's 2-year price target, just to be clear.
Okay.
But in general, what matters to us and for any stock in the market is, what does the future look like, not what does, instant messages from 3 years ago tell us about the past. So our view has been and continues to be that there will be a return to normalcy at some point with the 737. And I think Phil highlighted the key question, which is near-term production and whether or not that moves around. But we do think, look, the quarterly earnings have been very volatile for the stock. Obviously, a congressional testimony is going to be an absolute feeding frenzy for headlines. So, look, we expect continued volatility, and I've told folks this isn't an easy buy-the-dip opportunity, but we do think that there's substantial value and upside from here.
Sheila, you do say to buy the dip right now, and I'm wondering, Sheila, what makes you think that this is the dip to buy? We've been sort of strung along in this whole Boeing saga to believe that things will resolve itself sooner rather than later, and yet the timeline keeps getting pushed out. Negative headlines keep going forward. Muhlenberg has been sort of pushed aside a little bit. What makes you think that now is the time?
Sure. We are bullish. We like when people capitulate on a stock, and that's 3 downgrades in one day. I think, with the stock at $330, you're basically embedding free cash flow of $23 per share at 7% yield. That's almost cutting our 737 MAX margins in half. We know the next hand Boeing has is probably a negative one, whether it's a rate cut on the 787, whether it's further delays on the MAX. We can see that's coming, but we think that's being priced in by almost having where our current MAX gross margins are today.
Carter, do you think that Muhlenberg stays as CEO, or does he get pushed out?
At this point, there's a lot of political influence on that. So I think it's a tough question to answer, frankly. I think everyone thought when the initial news hit around lunchtime on Friday that it was destined that Muhlenberg was going to lose his job. And I think as context emerged around some of those messages and what had been shared and how they hadn't been hidden from some areas of government, and they just hadn't made it to other areas of the regulatory regime. I think that became a much more difficult calculus. And so I think that's where we find ourselves today. I don't think it does any good to do a leadership change while they're trying to get the airplane back in the air. And so I think the board would be reluctant to move too soon, too fast. But, ultimately, I think political pressures could play a big role in that.
Yeah, you've got political pressures, and you've got outside activists calling for the upheaval or overthrowing not just of the CEO, but of the entire board. Sheila, Boeing is an interesting company in that it really is part of a, at least as far as commercial airliners go, a duopoly with Airbus. But the one thing you can say that distinguishes Boeing from its competitor is that it has to have been financially dented by what's going on here. There may be orders that will be lost. There's going to be litigation, and they're going to have to pay carriers for the losses that they have suffered. And there may be large fines. How do you factor this all into your outlook?
I think people forget that Airbus had a management change themselves about a year ago, and they struggled. So I think that the current share price, I'll go back to it, going back to the financials, is pricing in another concession into what the MAX margins look like. So I'm pretty confident 2 years from now we'll see a different picture, and this turbulent time will be behind us. But for now, you might have 1 or 2 more pieces of bad news.
Carter, you also have this, your colleagues at Credit Suisse have downgraded the stock today to neutral, calling it a downward spiral. They're talking about return to service being delayed, public confidence taking a hit, labor productivity being a future problem, and legal risk. Do you think none of those issues are going to be as serious as they seem to?
Look, I think we think all those things are real. I'm sure it's tough to be an engineer and go to work at Boeing every day. It's probably tough to go to dinner parties on Friday night and have people ask you questions about whether or not your airplanes are safe. I think all of that stuff is real. I think where we are at this calendar point in the year for a large cap stock to say, can I stand by it here and defend it here? It's tough. And the catalyst path is a tough one. But I think at the end of the day, you've got to ask yourself, what does normal look like when you get beyond this into a recovery? And I think there won't be a material impact on production rates in this duopoly and profit rates. There will be significant costs that are incurred over the course of the next, let's call it 12, 18 months. But then once you get beyond there, you're going to get back to a well-functioning duopoly that's in a secular growth market. And that ultimately is where we will settle out. And I think that implies share prices that are much higher than that, than where we are today.
I mean, getting back to recovery is the key point there, Carter, and that road to recovery may be a long one. And I'm just wondering, is there a parallel in history, whether it be in the aerospace industry or elsewhere, that you think is comparable to what Boeing is going through right now, where a company is facing some sort of existential risk to its business, challenges to its culture, and whether or not culture bred sort of malfeasance, and a CEO that could be in the hot seat at this point? I mean, what comes to mind for me is in another industry, and that would be Wells Fargo. And so far, that scandal has been going on for 3 years, and the stock has underperformed and not really done much.
Yeah, but they're not competing in a duopoly where there's, other places, there's nowhere else to go, right? And you've got a company with a 100-year history here of making safe airplanes. And outside of these 2 MAX accidents, you've got, a pretty stellar track record for the 737. And so you think, what is the level of support that Boeing is going to have out in the field when this plane goes back to service? I would venture a guess that it will be more extensive than anything in the history of human flight. So I'd tell you that the plane's probably going to be incredibly safe. And in a duopoly where you're not facing a lot of competition, it's somewhat easy to begin to make those recoveries over time. Now, that may require a change in leadership, but I think ultimately we'll get back to where we started before this crisis happened.